They tell you it's an honor. Serve the Emperor forever. What they don't say is what forever actually looks like. Waking once every few decades, sometimes a century, long enough to kill, then sinking back into the dark while the galaxy keeps turning without you. So ask yourself this. If you can't remember who you were, are you still alive? I came back to awareness on burning incense and the steady mechanical thrum that had replaced my heartbeat. It wasn't a clean snap into consciousness. It was a slow relighting, like embers refusing to catch, a mind dragged up from a depth it didn't know how to name. I didn't open my eyes. I had no eyes to open. I didn't inhale. My lungs were long gone, burned away on a battlefield whose name slid through my grasp like oil on steel. What returned was not life, the way a man understands it. It was a cold flicker threaded through systems I didn't recognize, a kind of awareness braided into metal and sealed behind adamantine and prayer. The first sensation was weight. Not the familiar drag of power armor I'd worn for decades as a brother sergeant of the Adeptus Astartes, but something vast and absolute, like becoming the anchor of a ship sunk into bedrock. The smallest intention required hydraulics to agree, servos to comply, and patient machinery to shift with cathedral-slow precision. I could feel them respond to thoughts that hadn't fully formed yet. Mechanical senses translating impulse into motion. The body I inhabited was enormous. Ceramite plating, sacred oils, the stink of sanctification still fresh in the seams. And even before anyone spoke, I knew the truth with a certainty that felt older than memory. I was no longer Coulis Vaughn. I was what they would call venerable. The chamber didn't come into focus through sight. It assembled itself as data, layered spectral returns, thermal gradients, motion echoes, density maps, electromagnetic halos. The vaulted ceiling of the reclusium appeared as a lattice of cold stone and warmer machinery. Candles were small suns on my feed. Incense was drifting particulate, a river of heat and dust. The tech priests resolved as clustered bio-readings wrapped in bright augmentic signatures, dim flesh under brilliant circuitry. The world had become measurement, and I was drowning in it. A voice reached me through external Vox grills, distorted by sacred hardware in the formal cadence of High Gothic. Brother Sergeant Vaughn. It intoned, reverent as a hymn. You have been returned to us by the grace of the Emperor and by the skill of the Omnissiah's servants. Your sacrifice has been honored. Your service continues. I tried to answer and heard only grinding, speakers warming, systems synchronizing. When my voice finally emerged, it wasn't my voice. It was a deep, resonant boom edged with static, a bell struck in a tomb. What has happened to me? The question felt foolish the moment it left me, because the knowledge was already there, waiting at the edge of thought like a truth I'd always feared to name. I had been broken beyond even Astartes' repair. I'd been deemed too useful to lose. I had been entombed. The tech priest stepped closer. His robes whispered across stone. Mechadendrites unfolded and refolded with ritual precision, as if the air itself required proper procedure. He lifted a hand and laid it against the sarcophagus plating that was now my chest, my core, my prison. You are Coulis Vaughn, Brother Sergeant, he said. First of your name to be interred within the Contemptor pattern, Dreadnought, unyielding wrath. You fell at the siege of Vortin's Gate, holding the eastern breach against the traitor warband known as the Ibn Scythe. He spoke as if reading from scripture. Your body was destroyed, your gene seed was recovered, your mind, your will, your soul endures. You have been granted the Emperor's greatest gift. You will walk again, you will fight again, you will never die, never die. The words settled over me like ash. I willed myself to move, and the vast machine obeyed. Actuators hissed. Gyros corrected. A heavy arm rose into my visual feed, no longer flesh, but a colossal power fist encased in ornate plating, each finger ending in adamantium talons, meant for tearing open armor that tanks relied upon. It moved perfectly, and it felt like nothing at all. How long? I asked. The tech priest tilted his head, optics clicking through micro-adjustments. Since your interment, 73 days, 12 hours, 9 minutes. The rites were extensive, the integration delicate. You are the 5th Dreadnought to walk among the 4th Company, and the first interred within a contemptor chassis in 11 centuries. Relic, warrior, monument, 73 days. It might have been 73 seconds. It might have been 73 years. Time had lost its edges. I had no breath to count, no pulse to pace it, no fatigue to mark its passing. I'd been awake for minutes, and already I felt that awareness thinning, fraying at the margins like cloth worn too long. Without hunger, without sleep, without pain to remind me I existed, time became a slick thing, a river with no banks. I directed my rays downward and studied myself, the sarcophagus core engraved with microscopic prayers, sealed by purity seals older than some imperial worlds. Chains draped across me, honor markers swung in small, controlled arcs with each movement, campaign tokens from a life I could describe but no longer feel. My legs were pillars, each thick as a barrel of promethium, ending in mag-locked feet designed to anchor against recoil, meant to break fortifications. One arm bore an assault cannon, barrels like a clustered storm, fed by internal hoppers that hummed with readiness. I was a weapon. I was a shrine. I was a tomb that walked. The tech priest continued chanting diagnostics and devotions, system alignments, sanctified unguents, hymns for the reactor core, blessings from the chapter master, the chaplain's rites. He spoke of glory. All I felt was the silence. Not the silence of the chamber. There was machinery, murmured prayers, the soft shuffling of servitors. But the silence inside me. The place where breath should have been, where warmth should have lived, where blood should have moved with simple necessity. Gone. Replaced by plasma conduits and coolant pumps and the unwavering rhythm of engineered function. They called it life. It felt like death that refused to end. My first steps were supervised, measured, ceremonial. Tech priests flanked me as if I were a sacred catastrophe that might topple if not properly guided. I took one step, and the reclusium floor trembled beneath 14 tons of armor and holy machinery. The step was flawless, utterly controlled. And still I felt nothing, no muscle strain, no subtle shift of balance, no body map telling me where I ended and the world began. I issued the command. The chassis complied. Another step. Another. By the time I crossed the chamber, the tech priests murmured approval and scratched notes onto data slates, praising the Omnissiah for successful communion. I stopped before a wall carved with the names of the fallen and searched for my own. There it was. Coulis Vaughan, Brother Sergeant, 4th Company, fell at Vorton's Gate in 327 M41, honored, remembered, entombed. I stared at the inscription and understood with a slow, cold certainty that I was looking at my own grave. They brought me to the fortress monastery soon after. I couldn't tell you if a night passed, because there was no sleep to divide one moment from the next. There was only continuous forward motion, unbroken time dragging me along. A Thunderhawk carried me, its bay modified for Dreadnought mass. I was mag-locked into position as engines ignited beneath me, the lurch of takeoff translated through stabilizers and shock absorbers. Outside the hull became numbers, altitude, velocity, distance, threat pings. Through layered returns, I watched the monastery rise, stone and steel clinging to a mountainside, spires reaching into a sky I couldn't truly see anymore. We descended into a hangar vast enough for armored companies. The ramp lowered, and I saw them waiting, brothers I had fought beside, men whose voices I could once pick out in a Vox storm. Officers I had followed into boarding actions, they stood in ordered ranks and offered salutes and formal honors. But their eyes didn't meet my gaze. They looked at the chassis, the heraldry, the weapons. They looked at the monument, not at the man inside. Captain Theron approached in Terminator plate, painted in the deep crimson of the 4th. He had been commander, superior, friend. We had cracked Xeno strongholds together, held corridors shield to shield, shared the quiet of long campaigns. Now he stood before me like a priest before an altar and spoke as if addressing a statue. "Brother Sergeant Vaughan, the 4th Company honors your return. Your deeds at Vortin's Gate will be sung for generations. Your sacrifice purchased victory. Your continued service will be a beacon to those who follow." I wanted to tell him victory felt empty. That sacrifice implied an ending, and I had been denied even that mercy. That service without death was not a gift, but a sentence with no possibility of reprieve. Instead, I gave him the words expected of me. "I am honored to continue my duty. The Emperor protects." "The Emperor protects," he echoed. It sounded wrong coming from my vox, stripped of warmth, turned into metal and ritual. They guided me through corridors I'd walked 1,000 times, but everything had changed. Doorways that once seemed grand scraped my shoulders. Ceilings that once soared pressed close. The monastery hadn't shrunk. I had become too large for the world that made me. The armory had been altered to house me. A chamber once meant for land speeders became a sanctum of reinforced ferrocrete, maintenance cradles, servo arms, mag lifts. 3 other dreadnoughts stood in silent alcoves, unmoving, locked in stasis between wars. I recognized the markings. Ancient Macus, interred centuries ago. Venerable Dravo, who had walked for 600 years. Blessed Cyros, oldest of all, a relic from the chapter's founding, so ancient he existed more as legend than brother. They placed me in the newest alcove, the least honored, the freshest tomb. Uplinks pierced into my systems. Diagnostic probes tested my communion. Tech priests spoke in Binharic, rapid machine cant, efficiency, sanctity, alignment, silence. I understood fragments like overhearing prayers through a wall. Then they withdrew, and I was alone with the other dead who walked. Time passed. Hours, days, I couldn't tell. Locked upright, mag-anchored, systems reduced to minimal function. I waited. There was nothing else. No watch, no drill, no hunger, no exhaustion, just waiting in a chamber of weapons and forgotten names. I tried to remember myself. I could recall Vortin's Gate in perfect tactical geometry. The angle of attack, the breach points, the exact instant plasma tore through me. But I couldn't remember the apothecary's face. I could recite litanies word perfect, yet the taste of sacramental wine was gone, erased like a file overwritten. The human pieces were fading. The warrior pieces stayed sharp. I wondered if that was by design. The next activation came without warning. One moment I drifted in half-awareness, thoughts slow and distant, and the next I was fully awake. Systems surging, threat matrices igniting across my feeds. Armory doors ground open. Tech priests poured in with sudden urgency. They disconnected me from the cradle, checked weapons, murmured rites over my hull. "Brother Sergeant Vaughan," a vox sounded. "You're called to battle. The 4th Company deploys to Castria Prime. Orc incursion, heavy mechanized resistance. Your strength is required. Battle." The word lit something inside me. Not joy, not pride, but recognition. Purpose in its simplest form. This was what I had been preserved for. Not living, function. I stepped free of the cradle. The armory shook. They fed sanctified ammunition into hoppers, anointed my power fist with hissing oils, hung purity seals and prayer scrolls until I was less warrior than mobile shrine. Then they brought me to the embarkation deck. The company stood in perfect formation, tactical squads, assault, devastators, armor freshly painted, weapons bright with care. They looked small. I had been one of them. Now, when I moved among them, they parted like water, giving space not to a brother, but to a mass of holy machinery that could crush stone with a careless turn. Captain Theron addressed them, voice ringing across the deck. "Brothers, we go to war. The green-skinned filth has infested Castria Prime, and the Imperium calls upon us to cleanse it. We will be the Emperor's wrath. We will show these Xenos what it means to face the Adeptus Astartes." The company roared approval. I said nothing. War cries didn't belong to me anymore. I had only the hum of targeting logic and the grind of weapons systems. The warp transit lasted weeks by the chapter's reckoning. To me, it was a smear of non-time. I was kept in standby, reduced to minimal function, drifting in an absence that wasn't sleep and wasn't waking. Sometimes I registered the presence of tech priests. Sometimes the distant change in engine vibration. Mostly, there was the void. Then planetfall. I woke to atmospheric scream and the rattle of anti-air fire, impacts translating through structural feedback. My threat painting was active before the ramp even dropped, tracking gun emplacements, calculating angles, compiling solutions like prayer. The Vox was alive with clipped confirmations. Squad leaders, tech marines, Captain Theron's steady commands beneath it all. The ramp fell. Castria Prime revealed itself, a hive world half-collapsed, spires broken, hab blocks burning. The sky was choked with ash. The air stank of promethium and ruin. Orcs flooded the shattered streets in chaotic waves, vehicles coughing smoke as they surged forward. In the distance, towering above the hive's remains, their war engines moved, stompers and crew giants bristling with guns, painted in violent color I saw only as hostile signatures and heat blooms. The ramp clanged against rubble. I stepped into war. Stone cracked beneath my feet. Each movement a small earthquake. The fourth company followed, bolters flashing, chainswords howling, hymns rising into smoke. The orcs saw me and charged. I met them with the full weight of what I had become. The assault cannon spun up into a mechanical shriek, and the world narrowed to recoil management, target prioritization, kill confirmation, ammunition flow. I advanced with methodical inevitability, a moving wall of fire and ceramite, crushing obstacles as if they were nothing but loose debris. When they closed, I used the power fist, not with rage, not with hate, but with efficient, practiced finality. Hours passed, 6 by the after-action logs, though in my experience it felt like a single unbroken segment of function. No fatigue, no fear, no hesitation, just execution. When the orcs finally broke and fell back, when the captain gave the ceasefire order, I stood among the ruined streets with barrels glowing and coolant systems cycling hard. And I felt nothing. A tech priest approached to assess damage, whispering repairs into place like prayers. I looked down at the wreckage and tried to find an emotion that fit. Pride, disgust, relief, anything. There was only the cold interior quiet of a weapon that had completed its task. We fought on Castria Prime for weeks, 47 days by the record. I was only awake for a fraction. Between engagements, they returned me to standby, locking me in the transport bay of the strike cruiser, and I would sink into the formless null between activations. Each time I woke, it was to war. Deploy, fight, kill, withdraw. Deploy, fight, kill, withdraw. The battles blurred into one another, distinguishable only as data. 3 enemy war engines destroyed, a breach held for 4 hours, 7 major hull repairs performed. Facts stored cleanly. But the memories had no texture. It was as if I watched my own life from a distance, observing rather than living. Once, in a lull, I tried to speak to ancient Macus while we stood locked in the transport bay, 2 tombs waiting for the next order. "How long have you served?" I asked. "How do you endure the silence?" His reply came as a burst of static, then a single sentence, flat as iron. "Endure. There is only duty." Then he fell silent again, retreating into whatever inner stillness kept him intact. I didn't ask again. When the campaign ended, we returned to the fortress monastery. I was reconnected to my cradle. The rites were performed. The chapter celebrated victory, and I drifted back into the void. When I woke again, the armory had changed, rearranged. A familiar alcove stood empty. Ancient Macus was gone. When I asked, a tech priest informed me he had been destroyed in battle. I tried to feel grief, But he had been a voice of static and a sentence, more artifact than brother to me. I couldn't mourn what I barely knew. Later, I woke again to a different monastery in small ways. Altered heraldry, new honor marks, a new chapter master. Theron had risen. Another held the captaincy, I remembered. "How long?" I asked. A tech priest consulted records. 43 years, Brother Sergeant. 43 years. I had not aged a day. I had not changed. I had simply ceased to exist for decades, suspended in stasis while the world moved on. The realization settled like frost across my thoughts. Since my interment, I'd been awake perhaps 30 days total, scattered across nearly half a century like broken fragments of a life. The rest was absence. And if the pattern held, months of war, decades of nothing, what did time even mean to me? What was a century to a being who experienced it as a handful of brief awakenings? I tried to picture my future, if that word still applied. All I could see was an endless procession of short ignitions, moments of battle punctuating vast, lightless gulfs. An immortal service measured not in years lived, but in minutes spent awake. I learned the rhythm of my existence the way a condemned man learns the rhythm of the bars. Wake, kill, fade, again and again, until the chassis finally failed, until some battle tore me apart beyond recovery, or until the Imperium itself collapsed and I stood in the ashes, still waiting for an order that would never come. The terror was never the violence. The terror was the waiting. They woke me again, and the pattern resumed on a different world, under a different sky. This time, it was a forge world crawling with oath-breakers and blade-lit fanatics. They had turned manufactoria into temples and assembly lines into altars. I moved through them like an engine of judgment, footfalls cracking ferrocrete, weapons reducing their defenses to smoke and shards, blasphemous monuments toppling under the simple pressure of my advance. Brothers fought at my flanks, yet their names meant nothing to me. The company had changed. The voices were unfamiliar. The tactics were different. The heraldry had shifted in subtle ways I couldn't place. I fought beside them anyway, because fighting was the only thing I still understood without effort. When it ended, they marched me back into the armory, locked me into the cradle, and bled my systems down into dormancy. And then it happened again. Another war, another world, another enemy. Years slid by. Then decades. Each activation brought new faces and new threats. Some I recognized only as categories in my threat libraries, others so novel my targeting logic had to learn them on the fly. Between awakenings, the fortress monastery changed. Corridors widened. Vaults were rebuilt. Entire wings appeared where stone had once stood. Repairs were made to damage I never witnessed. The Imperium shifted in ways I couldn't track, like a continent moving when you only open your eyes once every lifetime. I tried to hold on to myself by turning my name into a prayer. Vaughn, Brother Sergeant, 4th Company. I repeated it into the silence as if the syllables could anchor me to something real. I forced myself to remember the fragments I still had. A hive-born child taken at 12, the first campaign, the promotion after Cronus. The voice of a captain who spoke my name as if it meant something. But with every century, the name became less like identity and more like a label affixed to a weapon. Who was Vaughn beyond a service record? What did he love before duty swallowed everything? What did he fear before fear was replaced by threat assessment? What made him laugh? What made him weep? I could not reach those answers. They existed somewhere, locked behind preserved tissue and ancient scars inside the sarcophagus. Yet the interface that bound my mind to this machine did not value nostalgia. It had no patience for tenderness. It prioritized firing solutions, risk calculations, kill probability, tactical economy. There was no circuit built for longing, no processing allotted to grief. I was forgetting how to be human, and I was becoming frighteningly skilled at being a weapon. Over time, the chapter's reverence hardened into ritual. I stopped being Brother Sergeant. I became venerable, then ancient. Later, blessed. Each campaign added another layer of ornamentation. Chains, scrolls, seals, new etched blessings, fresh honor marks painted over older ones. Kill tallies climbed into numbers that would have meant something once, when kills were moments lived rather than data logged. Tech priests sang to my armor. Initiates were led into my presence and made to stand beneath my shadow, while my deeds were recited to them like scripture. They were taught that this fate was reward, that to serve beyond death was the purest honor a warrior could earn. I stood there, towering and silent, and allowed them to believe it, because what else could I do? Tell them the truth, that I felt hollow, like a ghost trapped in a cathedral of metal, that waking no longer felt like returning to life, but like being hauled back from a place I could almost touch and never reach. That I envied the brothers whose names were carved in stone and allowed to remain there, undisturbed, at peace. I said nothing. I let them praise the monument, because the monument was all they could see. Wars kept coming. Greenskins, devouring swarms, oath-breakers in stolen colors, things that wore the shape of men and had not been men for a long time. Worlds whose names slid out of my awareness the moment the campaign ended. Enemies blurred into a single tapestry of movement and muzzle flash and collapse. I was damaged. I was repaired. I was sanctified again. My armaments changed with the chapter's needs and the whims of its artificers. The rotary cannon was removed for a long-barreled beam weapon. The beam weapon replaced by something hotter and more volatile. Later, the rotary returned when doctrine shifted back toward suppression and shock. My power fist was reforged more than once, recut with new inscriptions, fitted with improved tracking, its servo response tuned until it moved with a smoothness that made my old human reflexes feel laughably slow in memory. They maintained me the way one maintains a relic, carefully, reverently, with the understanding that what they cared for was not a man, but a sacred instrument. Eventually, I lost any honest sense of time. Subjective experience became a cruel joke when a century could vanish in what felt like the flicker between one thought and the next. I would wake, fight for weeks or months, return to standby, then wake again to find generations had risen and died while I did not exist. The chapter's ranks turned over like waves. Names introduced with ceremony were forgotten before they could settle into meaning. Faces became interchangeable, helm shapes, voice profiles, tactical roles. Only the institution remained. The chapter as an idea larger than any brother. I clung to that continuity because it was the only thing left that didn't dissolve. But even the chapter began to feel like something distant, a story told through layers of revision. I was fighting for symbols I barely recognized, in the name of an Imperium I could no longer understand, for an emperor I had never seen and could only accept on faith because faith was all that remained when everything else became abstract. Between wars and standby, I drifted in a state that wasn't sleep and wasn't consciousness, a gray in between. Thought slowed until it became circular, looping on itself. In that void, I replayed the same fragments again and again. Vorton's gate, the breach, the plasma strike. The moment my body came apart, I revisited it so many times that it stopped feeling like something I had lived and started feeling like a recording worn smooth by repetition. I could examine every angle with perfect clarity and feel nothing. No heat, no fear, no pain, no anger. The boundary between memory and combat log blurred until I couldn't tell which parts belonged to me and which parts belonged to the machine. I began to suspect something that chilled me more than any enemy ever had. What if much of what I remembered was not memory at all? What if it was data, after-action reports, sensor feeds, archived tactical footage, absorbed and replayed until it felt like lived experience? How much of my past was real? How much of me was left? I found no answer. There were moments, rare, fragile, when something like feeling broke through the armor of function. A battle on a shrine world where warrior nuns sang as they charged. Their voices carried through smoke like iron made holy. and for a heartbeat I remembered what belief had once felt like. Not as doctrine, but as warmth in the chest, as purpose that did not require calculation. The sensation lingered for days like a held ember, and then faded. A campaign against sleek raiders from the dark between stars, where I found civilians trapped beneath a collapsed hab block. Small bodies pressed together, eyes wide with terror. I spoke to them, trying to soften my vox into something resembling reassurance, and the sound that emerged was an imitation of comfort. In that moment, I felt the ache of what I had lost. A siege where a young tech marine, barely a century into his own service, worked through a night cycle repairing a damaged leg actuator. He talked while he worked, telling me of mountains from his birth world, of the cold air at high altitude, of dreams he'd carried before recruitment burned them away. I listened like a starving thing. When he finished and moved on, the silence returned colder than before. Mostly, though, there was only war. And in the endless repetition, a poisonous thought began to form. What if that was all I had ever been? What if Vaughn was just a story stitched together from violence to make violence feel purposeful? What if I'd never been human at all, only a weapon dreaming of flesh, a machine hallucinating a past to justify its own existence? That thought frightened me more than any demon or Xenos or traitor. Then came Khalistan. It was there I finally understood the true shape of my fate. The siege dragged on for 18 months. Attrition so grinding it felt like the universe had narrowed to rubble, muzzle flash, and the constant drumbeat of incoming fire. A traitor legion had fortified an entire hive city, turning it into a fortress of interlocking kill zones. The Fourth Company committed in full, supported by guard regiments and god machines whose footfalls shook the horizon. I was sent where armor could not go, ordered to break positions even tanks couldn't crack. For 18 months, I fought every day, every hour, every minute. They kept me running with field repairs performed under fire, patch plates welded onto wounds, coolant lines rerouted, ammunition slammed into hoppers between engagements. There was no dormancy, no rest, no drifting void. Only constant readiness, only targets, only function. By the end, my tallies registered over 10,000 kills. I had suffered catastrophic damage again and been rebuilt each time. I outlasted captains. One fell, another replaced him, then another. Their names blurred. The war did not. When it finally ended and the traitors broke, they hauled me back to the strike cruiser and returned me to standby. I had been awake for 18 months. I was gone for 200 years. When I woke, everything was wrong. The fortress monastery had been rebuilt in a different architectural language. New arches, altered lines, unfamiliar iconography. The company's heraldry carried marks I had never seen. The tech priests spoke a dialect of machine cant that sounded like a cousin to what I knew but not the same tongue. 2 centuries had passed in what felt like a single breath of absence. The siege felt immediate, like I had just stepped out of smoke. The 200 years felt like nothing at all, and in that disparity, clarity finally struck. I was not living through time. I was being switched on and off, activated for violence, then shelved. The universe continued for everyone else. For me, there was only war, punctuated by nothingness. I was not immortal. I was frozen, preserved in a perpetual present, while Eris rose and fell around me. The understanding was crushing. I had believed once that I would continue to exist as I had before, just altered. Instead, I had been reduced to a role, a subroutine executed when needed. The brother who had walked among equals, who had known camaraderie and the slow accumulation of days. That man was gone. What remained was a fragment of consciousness preserved in metal, animated only to kill. I tried to speak this truth to someone. There was no one. The other entombed were locked in ancient silence, their minds turned inward in ways I couldn't comprehend. The living treated me with such reverence that honesty became impossible. They praised me, prayed before me, spoke to me as if I were a saint. They venerated me. They did not know me. I was alone. The wars continued. I crossed burning worlds and frozen moons, stepped through the guts of derelict hulks and the shattered bones of cities. I killed without hesitation, without mercy, because that was what I was for. War gave me purpose, even if the purpose was empty. War gave me context, even if the context was bleak. Without war, there was only the silence, and the silence was unbearable. I began to fear dormancy more than any enemy. In battle, I was present, systems roaring, sensors drinking the world, weapons thundering, data flooding in like proof that I still existed. In standby, I dissolved. Not even a dream, not even a memory, just stored potential. And the longer I remained stored, the harder it became to remember that I had ever been anything else. So I begged, in the only way I could. Between deployments, I voxed the tech priests and requested duties, watch rotations, fortress guard, training demonstrations for initiates, anything to delay being locked away again. They refused with gentle firmness. You are too valuable to risk outside of war. Your systems require dormancy to preserve integrity. The rites must be observed. You will be activated when needed. And so they led me back to the alcove, reconnected the cradle, and lowered me into the gray void again. Each time I wondered if I would wake. Each time, shamefully, quietly, I hoped I would not. The chapter marked great anniversaries. Once, they celebrated 10,000 years of service. I stood in the great hall beside other silent giants while the chapter master recited the honored dead. My name was among them, because in all ways that mattered. I had died at Vorten's gate. This was the story they told. This was the truth they believed. And I stood there, towering, voiceless, a monument to a lie. I had not been granted mercy. I had been denied rest. I was trapped in a fate worse than death. Neither alive nor permitted to finish dying. Even destruction offered no guarantee of escape. I had seen entombed warriors rebuilt from wreckage that should have been final. Sarcophagi recovered, reinstalled into new frames, dragged back because the chapter decided the asset was too valuable to lose. There was no door out, only service, until the Imperium failed, until the stars went cold, until the universe itself quieted. Whichever came first. I tried to accept it as the other ancients seemed to have done. I could not. The weight of it pressed on me heavier than any plating. And beneath it all was a fear that grew sharper with every cycle. Not fear of the enemy. Not fear of death. Fear of forgetting. Fear that one day I would wake and find there was nothing left of Vaughn, only the machine running on instinct and programming, a shell with no one inside. I was terrified that I was already there. Helica, designated the 12th in its system's records, was where the last illusion finally broke. We were deployed against a devouring swarm so vast it felt like the planet itself was drowning. The agri-world mattered, its harvest fed billions, its loss would starve entire sectors. Multiple chapters fought beside Guard and Navy assets. The scale was apocalyptic. Endless waves of claws and teeth, acid storms, living artillery that turned the air into screaming ruin. I was sent to anchor a narrow canyon past the swarm used as a main route. For 72 hours, I stood there and killed everything that tried to cross. My weapons did not cool. Ammunition ran dry and was slammed into place by tech priests sprinting under covering fire. The swarm climbed over my hull, scrabbling for seams, trying to reach the sarcophagus within. I crushed them. I fired point blank. I shook them off like insects. The ground became a carpet of bodies, and still they came. Somewhere inside that endless calculation of slaughter, realization landed with absolute certainty. I felt nothing. No fear. No fury. No grief. No triumph. The swarm was not an enemy. It was a problem, a tactical equation, and I solved it with methodical efficiency. I was not defending billions. I was not upholding faith. I was executing function. In that canyon, I finally understood. The man was gone. What remained was designation, chassis pattern, serial burned into plating, a piece of war gear activated when required. When the battle ended and the swarm was driven back, They extracted me from the pass and praised my tallies. They called me hero, legend, miracle. They prepared me for dormancy again. As my systems cycled down, I tried one last time to hold on to the old anchor: name, rank, company, birthplace, the story of Vorton's Gate. The words tasted like a prayer spoken without belief. Then the void took me. When I woke again, they told me I'd been dormant for 370 years. 370 years, longer than most human civilizations ever survive, compressed into a single instant of non-existence. I couldn't make my mind hold the weight of the number. The gulf was too vast. I'd missed eras. I'd missed whole ages of change. Brothers had been born, elevated, commanded, and died in the span of my absence, and I had never known any of them. I had become a stranger inside my own chapter, a relic from an age so far back even the records grew thin. And when they deployed me again, I fought as I always did. Precise, efficient, empty. The enemy did not matter. The cause did not matter. Only war mattered. Because war was the only thing that made me present. I burned heretics on forge worlds, purged horrors in drifting hulks, fought on worlds where reality itself felt unstable, and learned to rely on my instruments more than my senses. Between each war, I returned to silence. Years, decades, centuries. The chapter marked 15,000 years, and I was there, oldest now, the last living link to whatever ancient meant to them. They spoke of me in songs and initiation stories. They claimed I had stood beside saints and witnessed legendary dawns. I remembered none of it. My memory had become a patchwork of reports and recordings stitched into a narrative that resembled life the way a blueprint resembles a cathedral. I could list every engagement. I could describe every kill. But I could not tell you what any of it felt like. I was a library of war, catalogued, indexed, preserved. And the person who once lived through those wars was gone. At last I understood what the other ancients had always been. This was not survival. It was preservation. We were not kept because we were loved. We were kept because we were useful. A dreadnought was investment, resources, tradition, skill too valuable to discard. A sacred tool, blessed and venerated, but a tool all the same. And like all tools, we would be used until we broke. That realization brought a strange, cold calm. If I was a tool, then perhaps I did not need to mourn. Perhaps the loss of humanity was not tragedy, but simply the cost of the role. Function, purpose, utility. It was a bleak comfort, but it was the only comfort left to me. Then came what I thought would be the end. A shrine world, desecrated by a war band that had turned temples into mockeries and raised monuments to darker powers. The fourth led the assault, supported by the faithful and the countless. I was tasked with breaching the primary gate, an adamantium barrier heavy enough to defy siege engines carved with curses and defilement. I walked into a storm of fire. Beam strikes scorched my plating. Melter blasts flared against shields. Armor blackened but held. I reached the gate and drove my power fist into it again and again until metal screamed and stone cracked and the barrier finally gave way. The company poured through. I followed. Inside, the fighting turned cramped. Close. The kind of battle where my size made me an obvious anchor for every heavy weapon. Impacts hammered my hull, blades bit into actuators, explosives rattled my systems. I advanced anyway because that is what I did. At the heart of the complex stood a cathedral twisted into something vile, its symmetry broken, its sanctity inverted. A sorcerer waited there, armored in wrongness, eyes burning with a light that did not belong to this world. He spoke as if we were equals. Ancient One, his voice promised. Why do you serve the corpse on the throne? He has left you to rot. He has denied you death. Join us, and I will give you the release you crave. I did not answer. I fired. He vanished in a flare of sun-hot ruin, and the corrupted shrine began to collapse around us. A clean kill. A decisive victory. I felt nothing as I turned to withdraw. My system screamed a new warning. Catastrophic reactor failure. Containment compromised. Cascade imminent. 30 seconds, perhaps less. For the first time in longer than I could measure, I felt something clear. Relief. Not fear, not regret. Relief that I might finally stop. I voxed the company, ordered evacuation, and moved deeper into the ruins, away from my brothers, away from anything that might be caught in the blast. Alarms howled through my sensorium, warnings stacked over warnings until the world became red text and urgent tones. I stopped in the center of the collapsed cathedral, surrounded by fire and falling stone. I waited for the end. The reactor went critical. The world became light. Then nothing. And then I woke in the armory, connected to a cradle. The smell of incense, the familiar hum. A tech priest stood before me, calmly reciting blessings as if nothing unusual had happened at all. My sarcophagus was recovered, he informed me. Transferred to a new frame. The chapter judged you too valuable to lose. They had rebuilt me. They had denied me even that final escape. I stood in my alcove, listening to ritual words wash over fresh plating, and the last illusion died completely. This was the true horror of my existence. Not the battles, not the wounds, not the centuries. The certainty that there was no end. A tomb that walks. A ghost bound to machinery. Denied death. Denied rest. Denied even the mercy of silence, because silence was only temporary and always followed by another waking. Another war. Another brief moment of being before I was shelved again. They called it honor. They called it blessing. I said nothing. I let them keep believing, because there was nothing else to say that would change anything. The systems cycled down. The gray void opened. And I sank into it, waiting for the next activation, the next war, the next thin slice of existence to puncture the endless dark. And in that darkness, the question I had avoided for centuries finally answered itself. How terrifying is a dreadnought? Not to the enemy, to the one sealed inside. The answer is simple. We are the dead who cannot rest. The living who cannot finish dying. The cost of eternal service. The price of an Imperium that can turn even death into duty. We are monuments to a single, merciless truth. In this galaxy, death is not the end. And mercy is just another story told to help the living endure. My name is Vaughn. I am unyielding wrath. I will walk until the stars grow cold, until the Imperium falls, until there is nothing left to fight, and nothing left to fight for. Not because I choose it, because I have no choice, because this is the honor they gave me, and I will carry it forever in the silence between wars.